So today I want to discuss how we can solve this transverse field Ising model in one dimension exactly. And the solution is instructive not just because you get exact formulae, but because it allows you to think in a slightly different way about the physics I described in very physical terms. But to do that, I'm afraid we need a little bit of language. Can we set up that clock? Okay, this is not happening. Oh, this is not a touch screen. You want to count down from? Yeah, okay. All right. So the language we need to set up is language that we use to handle the fact that a system of many bosons has wave functions which are symmetric under the interchange of any two particles, and a system of fermions has a wave function which acquires a minus sign if you exchange any two particles. This is just a fact of nature, and this severely restricts the kinds of many particle wave functions you are allowed to use when you describe physical properties of collections of identical particles. And the reason we need to take this detour and discuss how to think about these kinds of wave functions efficiently uh, is that the exact solution of the transverse field Ising model, at least one version of it, is simplest to write down in a language that makes it look like a system of free fermions, right? And to do, then you must work with the systems of n fermions, and to do that we need to have this language. So just to be self-contained, we're going to take a small mathematical or just formalism kind of digression to the sort of formalism of many-body physics. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So wait, my G multiplied the transverse field, right? Yeah. Yeah. Go on. Yes. 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 So that's the picture we drew. If you recall, actually, maybe I draw it here. Remember the picture I drew was there's one site, which is my site where I have the particle. And then I said there are these four privileged bonds. If the perturbation acts here, 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 or here, it moves the particle, right? And then there were these other bonds that also had special status. And then there's the generic bond somewhere else. So now what's your question? Yes. Right. That's why I keep track of all possible bonds, right? So the perturbation can act on the yellow bonds, it can act on the red bonds, or it can act at some generic bond not in the local neighborhood of the particle. That's what we were doing. So now go ahead. So what does Sz do at a site? It takes a plus x to a minus x to a plus x. That means if there's a particle, it destroys the particle. If there's no particle, it creates a particle. What? Yes. So that's what I'm saying. The perturbation can act anywhere on the lattice. Right? It's a sum of terms. There's one term for every bond of the lattice. Right? So I break the bonds of the lattice up into 3 groups. Yellow, red, and white. That's what I did last time. Maybe I used different colors, right? Now, if you're doing first order perturbation theory, the first term must be something that the perturbation acts and stays in the one particle subspace, right? So the only places such a thing can happen is the yellow bonds, because it will destroy the particle here and create it at the neighboring side, right? When you work out the next correction to this, which we also did, you must act on a single particle state in such a way with the perturbation that you get some state that is not a single particle state. That can't be done by acting on the yellow bonds. It can be done by acting on the white bonds or the red bonds. And we considered both cases, right? Okay. All right. Anything else from last time? I will just, as a background to the exact solution, go back to the language we were using last time after we do this and describe how things look on the ordered side. And we'll see an important distinction between one dimension and higher dimensions. That important distinction will be our first clue that there's something special about one. Okay? And that's actually why the model can be solved exactly. So anyway, let's go back to this. So I have some single particle Schrodinger equation, let's say a lattice version of it, maybe, doesn't matter, which I've solved. And I know some single particle orbitals, which make a complete set of states for the single particle problem, right? I can work like that in terms of eigenfunctions of the single particle problem, or I can just work in terms of eigenfunctions of the coordinate operator, just, the usual coordinate basis, right? Either way, I have some single particle states, and now I have n particles. Oh, I should reserve yellow for after the first rubbing of the board. I have n particles, right? And I want to think in terms of n particle wave functions or n particle kets in Dirac's notation that obey this rule that they must be symmetric or anti-symmetric under interchange, right? So how do I do that? Well, I start with a ket, which is obviously not of the right kind. I write it as, let's say, psi 1, psi 2, like that. And the notation here is there are slots. Each slot corresponds to a particle, the Hilbert space of one particle, right? At this level, the particles are notionally distinguishable, but we want to make them indistinguishable in a minute, right? So this can be read by saying the first particle is in state psi 1, the single particle state psi 1, second particle is in single particle state psi 2, and so on, right? This, of course, is bad. It's bad language, it's illegal language, because you are not supposed to know which is the first particle and which is the second particle. You're only supposed to know there is a particle in state psi 1 and a particle in state psi 2, right? The way that distinction comes about in the mathematics is you say you symmetrize or anti-symmetrize this state. And I'll put a label zeta here. Zeta will be +1 when it's bosons, -1 when it's fermions. Okay? That's 1 over square root n factorial. If there are n slots, sum over all permutations of n labels. See, what I've done is I've said that this slot, which is for my first particle, now is not in the state, single particle state psi 1, it is in some single particle state P of 1, where P of 1 is a permutation of n labels. So P of 1, 2, 3, 4 is what I'm calling P1, P2. It's just some permutation of these labels. There's n factorial of them. I sum over all of them, right? And every permutation has a sign. This is the usual thing we learn in mathematics. mathematics when we talk of permutations. You can write every permutation, all n factorial of them, as a product of interchanges, right? And you count how many interchanges you needed to construct that permutation. If it's odd, you put, so zeta is -1 for fermions. Sorry, I shouldn't put sign. I should put number of permutation, number of interchanges. So zeta equal to -1 for fermions, zeta equal to +1 for bosons. Right? So this, if zeta was -1, then -1 to the number of interchanges is the sign of the permutation. So for fermions, I can write this whole factor down as sign of the permutation. But since I want to work with both bosons and fermions, let me write it as zeta to the number of interchanges. Okay? And I'll sort of have a short form here. I'll just write zeta to the p. Zeta to the p means zeta to the number of interchanges that make up p. Okay? So that's now a legitimate state. Because if I now take this state, it's no longer possible for me to uniquely say that this particle is in this state, because I'm summing over all these possibilities, all the permutations, right? So this is a legal bosonic or fermionic state. We started with something that was not legal and we got to something legal. Okay. Now it's actually possible to work with these wave functions and describe n-particle states, but it gets quite painful if you want to do it this way, especially if your Hamiltonian doesn't conserve particle number. Supposing your Hamiltonian is such that it can create and destroy particles, then this gets quite hairy and it's not particularly convenient language. So there's a much better way of working. So let's go from this now to the better way of working, which is a more algebraic way in terms of so-called creation and annihilation operators, which you can manipulate very easily. And that will be a key thing in writing down the exact solution and interpreting what you got. Okay? So let me just go through this step by step very quickly. This is in many, many books. I'm just doing this for completeness. If maybe I should have a show of hands. How many have done sort of a many-body course where this is all being done and they have it in their head right now? Raise your hands, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Raise them higher. Let's see if it's a majority. So then I don't need to do all this. Raise them high. Whoever doesn't want me to do it, please raise your hand high. No, okay. All right. I couldn't count. All right. Anyway, the best place to read this from, which is in 3 pages, not more than 3 pages, is Feynman's book. Not Feynman lectures, but his book on StatMech. It's probably the shortest and cleanest statement of the formalism. Okay, so, and that's what I'm following. Okay. So in particular, if we use these orbitals to be just real space positions of particles, so you have particles at positions x1, x2, x3, x4 up to xn, then we would have a legal position ket, which would be exactly the same formula, but let me write it down once. And so on. Okay. So now we are used to working with wave functions, right? Not this ket language. So let's write down the wave function psi in this position basis, where both of these are sort of the legal versions of the states, right? So this is a small exercise you can do. You can write this as a sum over permutations. You can write that as a sum over permutations. Call those permutations P and Q. Remember that the product of 2 permutations is also a permutation. Give it a name, okay? And then if you give that a name, you will be left with the final answer. This is some other label. Notice this 1 over n factorial went away. That goes away because you have a sum of two permutations, you have a sum over two permutations, and then there's one delta function. You can do this yourself. So you get a product of these matrix elements. And what are these Aij? So Ai Pi for general P is simply Xi psi Pi. Right? These single particle wave functions. Okay? So now you can recognize what this is if zeta was -1. If zeta was -1, this simply says sum over permutations, sine of a permutation times a product of these matrix elements of the matrix Aij. And this is exactly our formula for the determinant of A, right? If zeta was, right? And this is what we would call a Slater determinant, just remembering things from your solid state, right? So this is the same thing you knew in that language, but just written slightly more abstract. Okay. Now, are these legal kets I've made normalized? Just as a test of your command over the formalism, are they normalized? You all think so? You're sure? Okay. So let's prove it for fermions first. You're right for fermions. So these kets are normalized. That's the statement. And the way you show that is, again, you take the ket and take its complex conjugate. You have a sum over two permutations. So let's write it this time explicitly. You have a 1 over n factorial. I'm writing the overlap of a state with itself. Right? So in general, I have overlapping with alpha q1, alpha q2. And this is some orthonormal basis I've used of single particle states alpha, right? The only way this overlap will be non-zero is these two permutations are exactly the same. If they are exactly the same, I'll get two factors of -1 or two factors of +1, so the sign will go away. And I'll just be left with a free sum because these are orthonormal, each particular individual overlap is 1. So the n factorial cancels, I get 1. So you're right for bosons. What about for fermions? What about bosons? Does this logic work? Why not? Sorry? Does it work? It doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is there's no good reason why two bosons can't be in the same state. That's allowed. See, when you anti-symmetrize a wave function, you require all the n labels to be distinct, right? For bosons, we know that there can be many bosons in a state. So some of these single particle states can be the same, right? Then it's not true that only one permutation P will match a given permutation Q to get a non-zero number. In fact, if there are n1 bosons in the first state, n2 bosons in some other state, n3 in the third state, if you count the state not in terms of what are the kets, but just ask the first single particle state, how many bosons are there? N1. Second single particle state, how many bosons are there? N2, like that. So work with quote unquote occupation numbers. So N1 bosons in the first single particle state. Alpha 1 and so on, N2 like that. Then what will this overlap be? So there will still be a free sum over P that will cancel this. But in addition, there will be some factors. Exactly. So in the case of bosons, the norm of a ket that we have defined is the norm square is n1 factorial, n2 factorial, right? So these are not normalized states for bosons, okay? So one more, I think half a board and we'll be done with this derivation. So let's just continue. Very good. Now I'll start with yellow. So the correctly normalized bosonic state, psi, zeta equal to +1, will be 1 over square root times, so right, the state I had originally defined had only a 1 over square root n factorial. I have to put in this extra factor and then it's a correctly normalized bosonic, right? Okay. So now let's do the next step. Now this describes all the wave functions or all the kets that you use to discuss the physics of n identical particles. But there are many physical situations where you want to talk of adding or removing particles. Many experiments, in effect, add a particle into the system or remove a particle, right? For example, when you do photoemission, you remove a particle and you ask what energy and momentum it had. So you must have in your formalism a larger description which allows you to take at the same time states of multiple total particle number, right? So of course that's obvious in this language. You just say the full Hilbert space is the space of such wave functions for each value of n total, right? But you also want to define operators that connect between them, right? So you can define, so let's say I had a state which was this, n particle state, which I defined in the usual way, right? Unnormalized right now. I've left out that. So whenever I put a bar, that's normalized. Otherwise, it's unnormalized. Distinction is only important for bosons. Okay? And I want to add one particle in a single particle orbital phi. So I want to define the operator A dagger phi acting on an n particle state, and I'll drop that label n to be the state So I constructed this state psi with some single particle orbital psi 1, psi 2, so on. Now I added one more orbital into that construction. So you just rewrite the formula I gave you earlier, but with an extra orbital. This describes an n plus 1 particle state, right? For consistency, you define the single particle state phi, which has just one particle in orbital phi, as the action of A dagger of phi acting on a vacuum state, which is the state with no particles. This is just language, we just want to make it all consistent, then we can use it very algebraically without thinking very long. That's the advantage, yeah? So this creates a single particle in orbital phi. This creates it by adding a particle to the vacuum. If you add a particle in this orbital to a pre-existing collection of particles in orbital psi 1, psi 2, you get that, right, which you call it, right? Okay. This definition is general. It could be 0. The action of A dagger phi on psi could give you 0. In the fermionic case, it will give 0, because if phi matched one of these orbitals, when I do the anti-symmetrization, I get 0, which is a way of automatically enforcing Pauli exclusion, right? So this formalism knows about Pauli exclusion, right? It's constructed to know about Pauli exclusion. Now, I want you to imagine, now if you have done this, the next statement, let's rub this out. So if I have an operator A dagger phi, I should be able to ask what's its adjoint. Right? So we want to use this formalism and the definition of A dagger of phi to decide what's the adjoint. What does A of phi mean? Right? How do you define its action? In a way that it is the adjoint of A dagger. Right? So to do that, you take some, so let's call the adjoint A of phi. We want to know what is the action of A of phi on a ket, right? But we know the action of A of phi on a bra because we know the action of A dagger on a ket. So we can write the following thing down. N minus 1, you will see why. A of phi is by definition A dagger of phi correct? This is by definition. If you want something which is the adjoint of A, it must satisfy this equation. Okay? Now take the overlap of this with your n particle state psi. So let's do that here. So ask, what is this? I'm suppressing the zeta label. These are all properly symmetrized or anti-symmetrized states, but not properly normalized. Okay? So ask, what is this? It's equal to phi agreed? Where did I get this from? I got it from action of A dagger phi on this state, which by definition gives me a phi, gives me an extra particle in an orbital phi, and then x1. Right? And I just took the adjoint of it. Right? Now, use the formula for each of these states and notice that I can write this in the following way. Permutation of n labels Everybody with me here? I've just used the definition on both sides and gotten rid of a redundant sum over permutations and cancelled the 1 over n factor. Right? Now this is a permutation of n variables and there are x, the x are n minus 1. Right? So now you imagine you bring the psi. So this I can now write. So what is this? This I can write as some, so let's say P1 was some number k, right? So then this I can write as k equal to 1 to n zeta to the k minus 1, right, phi psi k, and no psi k, that one label is now missing. Okay. This you can prove simply by imagining that you bring psi k to the left. When you do that, you have to pay this price in terms of factors of minus 1. Okay. So this gives you what the definition, what the action of A is on a ket. Is this step clear? Is it not clear? Okay, there's a law of the excluded middle. Yeah? It's clear or it's not clear. Which one? This step. Okay, this step is the easy step. This step I've just blindly used the formula that allows me to take these overlaps. Right? I write each one of these as a sum over permutations, the way I defined it. So this is sum over p 1 over square root n factorial zeta to the p psi p1 psi p2, right? And I write the same thing there. It's a little inconvenient to write because this is not an x, but it's the same thing. I permute these symbols among the slots, right? Then I take the overlap. What matters is the product of the two permutations. The rest is a free variable, right? So there's one free variable you're summing over. That's this one now in this language. And you've got these overlaps, right? Now in this formula, k is whatever p of 1 happened to be, right? Depending on what it is, you pick up a sign. You should go back at maybe today evening and just go from here to here calmly, the 3 or 4 orbital example. You will see that the sign you pick up is exactly k minus 1, the k minus 1 power of minus 1. You pick up k minus 1 factors of minus 1 when you do this. And then you have to sum over all k, because this could be any one of them, 1 through n. Okay? So that's what you got. So this allows you to say what A of phi does. What does A of phi do? Acting on a state psi 1 psi n. Well, it gives 0 if phi is not one of these orbitals, right? And if it is one of these orbitals, it removes that particle. No psi k. Supposing phi is the same as psi k, right? So it's delta phi psi k sum over k with a sign into a sign. And what is that sign? That sign is how many of the other orbitals you have to cross to get to psi k. So that's the sign, which is zeta to the k minus 1. Okay? So just like so we defined A dagger to be adding a particle. We have proved that its adjoint consistently corresponds to removing a particle, but with a sign. And the sign comes from fermion antisymmetry. When you added it last. But when you remove it, you could be removing a particle that was put in much earlier. And you have to interchange to bring it last and then remove. Those interchanges are this sign. Okay? For bosons, there is no sign. A dagger of phi adds a particle, A of phi removes a particle. Okay? So these are these operators which we have defined now. These are the creation and annihilation operators for bosons and fermions. Because of this sign, there is a difference in the algebra they satisfy. So we'll write that down next, and that ends our digression. So for bosons,
clearly doing A dagger phi 1, A dagger phi 2 is the same as doing it in the opposite order for two different orbitals, right?
So if you're creating particles in two different orbitals, for bosons it doesn't matter what order you act. For fermions it matters. Right? What happens for fermions?
Minus, because there's an extra interchange involved. Okay.
What if you add a particle and then remove it, and compare that to removing a particle and then adding it? Right? We can use these definitions to work that out.
So compare A of phi 1, A dagger of phi 2 acting on some ket psi n.
Right? Let's write down what this is. First you create, so this is A of phi 1 right? Now to destroy you use the formula we had earlier, right? You get so first of all this phi 1 could be one of these labels, psi 1 to psi n, and then you get the same formula there which we had earlier, k minus 1 let's say it was the kth label, and then you've got behind a state which is phi 2, psi 1, no psi k, psi n, right? But it could also be that phi 1 is phi 2, right? So then there's an extra term which is phi 1, phi 2. There's these two terms. Okay? Now do it in the opposite order. Right? Acting on the same ket. Now you got to remove first. Right? Sorry, there's a k here. That's what I was missing. Why is there a k here? Because there's an extra interchange I will need to do to bring that psi k out. Interchange with psi phi 2. So instead of k minus 1, it's a k. Here, there's only k minus 1 interchanges. Right? Compare these two actions, right? And you will realize that A dagger phi 1 phi 2 plus zeta A dagger phi 2 A sorry A phi 1 in the previous step what happened? Oh, so yeah, sorry. So there's a dagger. I should act. I skipped a step, right? And then I'll put a phi 2 there, right? So let's write. Do I need to write it down? Not really, right? So there's one. So let's remove the dagger phi 2 and put a phi 2 there, right? So this final ket is the same as the final ket here. There's a sign difference. And that's why if you act one way and do zeta times action the other way, you get 0 except when phi 1 is equal to phi 2, otherwise you get this leftover term, right? Times the identity of it. Sorry? No, of course not. This is a number. Right? This is, you've taken the overlap, you've done the integral phi star times psi, this function, and integrated. Right? This is a number. Remember, overlap of two vectors is a number. Yeah? So you see, this is the algebra that these operators that create and destroy particles, bosonic and fermionic, obey. Right? In one case, all the A daggers commute among themselves and the A's commute among themselves. In the other case, all the A daggers anti-commute among themselves and A's anti-commute among themselves. And this one you can write compactly. Let's write this here. This one you can write compactly by saying commutator of A alpha A dagger beta is delta alpha beta for bosons, and anti-commutator A alpha A dagger beta is delta alpha beta for fermions, where alpha and beta denote orthonormal single particle orbitals in which you are creating. Okay? Good? So this is the language we want to use when we describe systems of many bosons or many fermions. Today's lecture we will have occasion to discuss a system of many fermions. What's more, fermions whose particle number is not conserved by the Hamilton. Okay? So we are going to use this formalism. In the next lecture we'll use this formalism for bosons. Okay? So now knowing this algebra doesn't help much if you are not aware of its representations, if you don't know how to construct states, right? And this all of you must be familiar with. All of you remember that there's a number operator you can define, yeah, which is A dagger alpha, A alpha, right? You remember that it counts the number of particles you remember harmonic oscillator, right? So that's what we are going to use. So we are going to remember the following things from your treatment of the harmonic oscillator in quantum mechanics, generalized to the fermionic case. So let's write those things down. So now forget the wave functions, just take this algebra, right? The following are true statements, and let's just write those statements down without proving them. Proof requires sort of half a minute of thought in each case, if you don't remember your harmonic oscillator. Let's first do the bosonic case. Actually, let's first do the fermionic case. Supposing I had A alpha, if I had just one pair of guys, A dagger equal to 1, anti-commutator, right? And we want to know what are the so then we ask, what are the eigenvalues of A dagger? This is a Hermitian operator, what are its eigenvalues? Very easy to say that A dagger A has two eigenvalues, 0 or 1, right? And these states you write as 0 and 1, and A dagger of 0 is 1 and A of 1 is 0. Exercise, prove this. Prove it just from this fact. Very easy to do. Okay? The hint is you have to use the fact that if V is an eigenvector, then you act with A on V and ask about the norm of V. Norm of EV. Okay? V is an eigenvector of A dagger A. You act on it with A and ask what is its norm of the result, and all this will follow. Okay? I'm not doing that here. For bosons, we know what happens from the harmonic oscillator. because harmonic oscillator creation annihilation operators obey the same algebra, so it must have the same eigenstates of A dagger. We know that A dagger A has eigenstates labeled by integers n, right? We know that A dagger of n is square root n plus 1, n plus 1, right? N is positive integer, and A of n is root n, n minus, right? We know these things. So now what's the connection? So now that we know this, let's go back to the actual physics we were talking about, which is n particle states. And let me erase this part down. Now remember that my normalized bosonic states had those extra factors of 1 over square root n. So my normalized bosonic state psi 1 up to psi n was 1 over square root n1 factorial n2 factorial, like that, times some labels, n labels, plus 1. Right? That was a normalized bosonic state with n labels. And n1 just said in those n labels, one of the labels appeared n1 times, first label, the second label appeared n2 times, like that, right? So it was, for example, phi 1, n1 times, then phi 2, n2 times, like that, right? That was a bosonic state. So you had n1 particles in state phi 1, n2 in state phi 2, and so on. Now we know the action of A dagger of some phi, right, on a general ket, on an unnormalized ket, on this one. We can use that and ask what is the corresponding action in these kets. Okay? And I can write these kets, these normalized ones, simply as n1, n2. Right? I don't need to write everything down. I can just say that the first orbital appeared n1 times, second orbital appeared n2 times. Right? This is a more physical way of writing. It just says how many bosons were in the first orbital, how many in the second orbital. Right? Knowing the action of A dagger on this, I can ask what's the action of A dagger on that. Okay? And you can check that A dagger, any particular label, J, acting on n1, n2, which is now normalized, right, is square root nj plus 1, n1, n2, nj plus 1. Right? Now identify this with what you know from the harmonic oscillator, and you see that the operator A dagger j aj, therefore A dagger j aj counts number of particles in orbital j. Okay? That completes everything we need. From scratch, we have derived everything we need for the next 45 minutes. Okay? So, summary, there are creation annihilation operators, A dagger, that create or annihilate particles in orbitals, which are single particle orbitals. A dagger A counts how many particles there are in a given orbital. They obey this algebra. Okay? If you see this kind of operator emerging in some formal calculation you do, you can write the Hamiltonian in terms of them. You can immediately step back and say, aha, this is a system of free bosons or a system of free fermions, and write down everything you need to know based on your knowledge of Fermi-Dirac statistics, Bose-Einstein statistics. Okay? So that is the basic thing we are going to use. We are going to take this transverse field Ising model, which looks more complicated, and rewrite it in a way that it looks like a system of non-interacting fermions, but with a small twist. The number of fermions is not conserved by the Hamiltonian. Hamiltonian itself creates and destroys fermions. Okay? So let's write that down. So this part is clear to everybody, especially to people who have not seen this before. It takes a little bit of digestion. It's extremely simple, but think about it and then ask me tomorrow if there's something confusing. Okay? Those of you who've done many body physics in a lecture course, sorry, you wasted 20 minutes, but let's proceed now. So let's go back to the transverse field Ising model. So let's recap from last time. We saw that in the paramagnetic phase, in the phase where nothing is ordered, all the spins follow the transverse field, and there's a unique ground state. There are well-defined particle-like excitations, order by order in perturbation theory. Their shape or their internal structure gets renormalized a little, but they remain well-defined excitations. You can work out their dispersion. The gap never closes. And we said there will be a critical point where this perturbation theory breaks down, right? And on the other side, we stopped by saying, look, there's doubly degenerate ground states. Right? We didn't talk about excitations. So we just talked about this tower of states that was collapsing. In this case, there were only two states. We had some confusion about whether the splitting is e to the minus L to the d or something else. And we stated a problem, which if you could solve, you could confirm this vigorously. Right? We gave a heuristic argument why this is true. It was at odds with some classical intuition, but let's leave that open. In any case, this gap collapses. This is the tower of states that Anderson talked about in a particularly simple setting. Right? He talked about examples where there's actually infinitely many states that all collapse. Here we have a very simple model, so there's just two of them collapsing. And this collapse signals symmetry, okay, at zero temperature. Now what about excitations? Well, the simplest thing, so here's where there is a difference between 2 and higher dimensions and 1 dimension. It's the first clue that there's something special in mind. So let's draw a 2-dimensional lattice. And you start with, so remember that this gap is collapsing, which means we are allowed to work with, in the thermodynamic limit, we are allowed to work with wave packets, not exact eigenstates. The wave packet we make is this eigenstate plus this eigenstate by root 2. But this eigenstate itself is up plus down, and that is up minus down, the other way around. So when you take the linear combination, the wave packet is nothing but the classical picture you would have drawn, all up. This picture that you were drawing, you were saying there are two states, this and the other one. Those are actually the two stable wave packets you can make that correspond to symmetry plane. Right? So here's a particularly concrete example where everything I said in my first lecture you can see. This is the wave packet we start with. The thermodynamic limit, this is infinitely stable and symmetry is broken. And now we are asking what are the excitations above this symmetry broken state. So in 2 dimensions, all the spins are up. Clearly what you can do is you can put one spin down. So there's no mystery about single particle excitations. They cost energy, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 into 2, 8J. Right? Each broken bond costs 2J. There are 4 of them, 8J. So here I would draw 8J gap, and let's not draw this width in such an exaggerated way. Let's basically say it's degenerate. Right? So this is 8J. What's the next excitation? And now I don't need to go through the song and dance. You can convince yourself that you can do perturbation theory, and this will be a particle, and it will have some well-defined dispersion that you can work out. The only difference is the kinetic energy doesn't come to first order in perturbation theory, it comes to second order. Because the transverse field can only flip one spin at a time, and you need to flip this spin back and flip the next one down. And that's the first kinetic energy. So there's some details that are different. The spectral sort of epsilon of Q comes in at a higher order in perturbation theory, but there is some well-defined particle-like excitation. Again, it will acquire some internal structure as you go to higher order in perturbation theory, but it's stable. Right? Now think about the two particle sector, right? So two particle sector is two flipped spins. Now in two dimensions, there's a big difference whether you put these two spins like that, right? Making a molecule like this, which can be like this or like this. So you could make a molecule like that, like that, like that, or like that. This is one of the lattice animals he was drawing yesterday, Rajesh. Or you could put the second particle somewhere else. Right? The energies are completely different. If you put it somewhere else, it's straightforwardly 16J. Right? You pay this cost twice. And then plus perturbative corrections. Right? We are not talking about how you do that perturbation. From the last lecture, you can believe me when I say it's done. Right? But if you do this, the energy is less. Right? How many bonds are broken? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's 12J. So there's a molecule which has significantly lower energy. This is not a perturbative difference. This is a large number. Right? And so the molecule has its own status as a separate kind of excitation, as a different kind of particle, which will have its own dispersion relation. So this will have some dispersion. It will have its own internal structure. This will have its own dispersion and internal structure. And you get this kind of structure of excitation in higher dimension, 2 and higher dimension. Yeah? Now we are in the small g element. Remember? We are doing the ordered side. Yeah? The perturbation now is the transverse field. Yeah. Okay? So to order g square, this acquires a kinetic energy. For this to acquire a kinetic energy, you have to go to order g to the fourth. Same thing for here. But the details of the dispersion are different. The details of the form factor are also different. To leading order, this molecule's form factor becomes this plus this, some linear combination. So it acquires a sort of a D-wave character. Okay, this molecule. Those of you who are familiar with superconducting. So you can do all this. This is good, right? Think about one dimension now. So you have all up spins, that's your wave packet. You flip one. That's your single particle excitation, you would say. Right? So let's draw the picture here. So doubly degenerate state, single particle thing, costing 2J. Right? And you would say, okay, this is a particle, it acquires kinetic energy, blah, 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 blah. Now think of two particles. If I put them next to each other, this also costs energy 2J. Right? Think of three particles. This also costs energy 2J. So there's something very weird going on. Right? And what's going on is what you were thinking of as the particle, as the independently propagating excitation is not the fundamental excitation in one dimension. Because in one dimension, the fundamental excitation you can make, if boundary conditions allow you to do it, is to tunnel between the two ground states. Right? You have up, 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 and then down, 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 down. Right? So sorry, this is 4G. Right? This costs 2J. Costs less. And clearly, it doesn't matter where the next one comes up. Supposing you had periodic boundary conditions. So you had to come back to the original wave packet. But you can come back anywhere. It costs the same energy, 2J plus 2J, 4J, right? And that's the reason why what you thought was a particle was not giving you anything sensible. So this is the elementary object. Periodic boundary conditions can force you to have this elementary object always come with partners that are of the opposite sign. Right? So the actual particle-like excitations are these solitons and anti-solitons that tunnel between the two ground states. And this is the first signal that something very funny is going on in one dimension. Now, if we had one more lecture, I would have done this really fun calculation where I would have worked out the dispersion of this. It's really nice to do to leading order in G, very instructive. And then I would have actually done the two soliton calculation perturbatively and shown you that there's something amazing about its scattering matrix. See, if I have two particles in one dimension, that come and collide, the only thing they can do is they can exchange momenta. Right? That's the only non-trivial thing they can do. Or they can pass through each other. Right? Only non-trivial thing they can do is exchange momentum by energy and momentum conservation. So the interesting question to ask is, what is the phase factor acquired when you send in these two waves and they bounce back? And you can make a very general argument by solving just the problem of a single particle facing an impenetrable delta function barrier to show that for small enough momentum, when a particle hits this barrier, this delta function barrier in one dimension, which is like the other particle, and reflects, the phase factor is always -1 for small enough momentum. That's a general statement having to do with the non-relativistic quantum mechanics of a single particle hitting a barrier. So, delta function barrier comes, goes back. Solve this problem by matching boundary conditions, and you will find that for small k, the phase factor for reflection is -1. Okay? What you find here perturbatively to leading order, then you can actually work a little bit harder to next leading order, is that it's -1 for all momentum. Okay? And that's only true because of the structure of the Hamilton. So again, there's something very special about these soliton anti-soliton particles that's already visible in perturbation. But you can't really use that to do the full calculation. So now we are going to switch and just write down the solution in terms of fermions. And that will make it clear that the best way to think of these is actually as non-interacting fermions. Rather than thinking of them as impenetrable bosons that always have a -1 at all momenta for scattering back, we think of them as free fermions, and that -1 is just the fermion interchange, -1. Okay? All right. So you can do the calculation and you find that actually, although it's a loud process, so if you are at high enough energy, it's actually allowed to create more domain anti-domain pairs. But you find that perturbatively you never create it. Annihilation will lower the energy. No? You're doing elastic scattering, you don't lower energy. You'll have to think about the inelastic. Energy and momentum must be conserved, right? So you can do the reverse though. You can send them in fast, right? So then they have enough energy that they could seed extra domain anti-domain pairs and lower the overall kinetic energy at the cost of creating extra particles. You find that in perturbation theory for the simple Hamiltonian nuclide, that also doesn't. So these are all clues that our simple Hamiltonian is very fine-tuned. Okay? And these are all really fun calculations to do and extremely instructive. In many ways more instructive than the actual exact solution. But today we want to get to the end, so we'll write down the exact solution. Okay? Yes. Yeah, so we'll get to that. We are going to write that down now. All right. So here's how you solve it exactly. Okay. You notice the first important fact that sigma mu and sigma nu anti-commute at the same site. So if you have spins at a given site, the sigma x, sigma y, sigma z, 3 Pauli matrix operators, right? Take their anti-commutation, right? What is it? So take sigma x, sigma y. Right? Why? Because sigma x, sigma y is I sigma z, but sigma y, sigma x is minus I sigma. Okay? But of course, anti-commutator of sigma x with itself is 2, because each Pauli matrix squares to 1. Okay? So up to a rescaling, these obey at a site the same algebra of anti-commutators that fermionic operators obey. We saw that, right? So the intuition is this has something to do with fermions. The catch, of course, is that two Pauli matrices on two sides by definition commute because they are acting in different Hilbert spaces, right? So they are not fermions, but you can construct fermionic operators from them. So the way you do that is you say that you write, first we'll write the Pauli matrices in terms of fermions and then we'll reverse the concept. Okay? Sigma x at a site j we'll write as 1 minus 2 times C dagger j Cj. So C dagger j Cj is, so let me just say, we have we have spinless fermions that can be created or destroyed in orbitals j at sites j. Right? So we are imagining a many fermion system. Fermions have no spin, they are not electrons. And the single fermion can live at this site or that site or that site or that site. Right? So corresponding to that, you have creation and annihilation operators labeled by the site, just like we did in the general theorem. Right? So we write sigma x as this. What is this doing? This just says count the number of our fermions at site j. If there is no fermions at site j, sigma x is plus 1. If there is a fermion at site j, sigma x is minus 1. Okay? So we just write this down. We have to check that everything is consistent, but we write this down. Then we write sigma z of j as minus the product over j less than j prime less than j, 1 minus 2 C dagger j prime, Cj prime, Cj plus C dagger j, right? We know that sigma z flips the eigenvalue of sigma x. So it must go from having no fermions to having fermions and vice versa, right? So you must have a Cj plus Cj dagger there at site j. But now you want to make sure that things properly anti-commute for the fermions and commute for the Pauli matrices, right? And that's achieved by this string. What this is saying is that you take, so it's best to think of open boundary conditions. You start from the left and you count how many fermions are here, how many are here, how many are here, how many are here. Each one of them gives you either a plus 1 or a minus 1 because this is just the parity of the fermion number. The fermion number is 0, you get 1. Fermion number is 1, you get minus 1. Right? So you get this product of signs up to the previous site. And then at this site, you do Cj. The claim is that this is a legitimate change of variables. So it's clearly legitimate in the sense of the size of the Hilbert space. Every site there's a two-dimensional Hilbert space which you can say is fermion present or absent. That part is okay. Now you have to check that all the commutators on one side and anti-commutators on the other side work out. Right? So that we can check. Before checking it, let's just write the inverse relationship. Let's just write other pieces of this correspondence down. So by the way, you should check that if I make this definition, then a consistent definition of sigma y at a site j is minus pi j prime less than j, 1 minus 2 C dagger j prime, Cj prime. This is that factor of signs multiplied to each other. And C dagger j minus Cj by I. I is the square root of minus 1. That's why I'm trying to be careful. All sites will be labeled by j's. Okay. The reverse relationship, which you should be able to check quite easily, is C dagger j, the creation, is minus product of j prime less than j, sigma x j prime, sigma z j plus I sigma y j by 2. little bit of algebra which you should do, and you can then check that with this definition, all the C's and C daggers will obey the correct anti-commutation relations that tell you in advance that yes, these are operators that do create fermions at these sites in the sense that we've already worked out. So in formulae, this says Ci, Cj or Cj prime is equal to Cj dagger, C dagger J prime is 0 and Cj J prime is delta J prime. This follows, I claim, from this one definition, which you can check. This definition and properties of Pauli matrices ensures that this algebra is satisfied. So you can take these operators to be legitimate fermionic operators. Okay? And conversely, you can write the spins in terms of them like that. Okay? Now we'll see what's the magic of the particular simple Hamiltonian we wrote down. And we'll see how it gets spoiled by doing anything else. So now take the Hamiltonian that we had, nearest neighbor coupling between sigma z and a transverse field acting on sigma x, right? And plug this in, I'll give you a minute and see what you get. Just write it down, it's very straightforward. Would somebody like to tell me what you get? Do the gamma term first, the transverse field term. What do you get? Minus J sum over J. What does this term do? Good. Okay. Now the other term. And it's the other term in which you see the sort of magic of the simple nearest neighbor form. So remember that sigma z is this annoying string times something simple. Draw a picture. Here's side j plus 1. The operator sigma z at side j involves this string, right, up to the previous side. The operator for j plus 1 involves the same string, but one more, right? Now, up to j minus 1, every sign in that string appears twice. If it's minus 1, it doesn't matter, right? You get two factors. So, only place where there is a non-trivial sign is at j, coming from the second string, the string attached to j plus 1. Right? Good? Okay. So, write that down. So, you will get Cj plus Cj dagger, a sign, and Cj plus 1 plus Cj plus 1 dagger. Then use this anti-commutation properties to take this through that sign. Okay? And you should, by doing that, convince yourself that you get Everybody got this? Any questions about where this came from? Shall I proceed? Okay, let's go ahead. So now I have a question for you. This has gotten very formal, very algebraic. So it's good to go back and ask, where are the symmetries that we know about? So there was only one symmetry in the transverse field Ising model. It was the symmetry of taking all the spins and flipping them. If it was up spin in the z-axis, you made it down. Right? Global spin flip symmetry. Z goes to minus Z was a symmetry of the Hamiltonian. Right? This is some strange Hamiltonian for fermions. It counts the number of fermions at every site. It makes fermions hop. So it destroys a fermion at j plus 1, puts it at j, and vice versa. This is the complex conjugate. But it also creates pairs of fermions, right? And destroys pairs of fermions. Right? It's a strange Hamiltonian. Unfortunately, it's not a Hamiltonian where I can fulfill my original promise. I told you, let's write things in terms of fermionic operators. I'll get something, I can just look at it and say, aha, this is a free Fermi gas, right? And then I can use Fermi-Dirac statistics. This is a free gas, all right, there's no interactions, but it has pair creation and pair destruction. So I can't immediately start writing Fermi-Dirac statistics for anything just yet, right? So we need to do a little bit more work, but before we do that, and that little bit more work is also a little bit algebraic, let's go back and ask, where's the symmetry? Where's that Z2 symmetry of spin flip in this language? Ask yourself in the original problem, what is the operator that acts on a state and flips all Z to minus Z? It's the product of all the sigma x's, right? That's the operator that implements that. What's that in this language? It's the product of all the signs coming from the fermion numbers. So it's actually convenient to rewrite this as e to the I pi ng. You can check, since nj can only take two values, it's a trivial rewriting, just check it by hand. If nj is 0, this is 1 and that's correct. If nj is 1, this is minus 1 and that's also correct. So this is a correct formula if C's are fermions, right? So you write it like this, the operator that implements this spin flip in fermion language, so spin flipping operator, right, is simply e to the I pi n total. The total fermion numbers parity. Yeah? That's the operator that implements a spin flip, right? Now we know that a spin flip is a symmetry. So it commutes with the Hamiltonian in the original problem. So it must be that the way that symmetry is expressed here is that your Hamiltonian conserves fermion parity. Right? So it can create and destroy particles, but it can never change the particle number by an odd number. And that's exactly what's happening here. This is like a superconductor where two fermions make a Cooper pair and vice versa. So as far as the fermions are concerned, they seem to disappear, right? If you have done the mean field theory of superconductivity, usually you have terms like this multiplied by the order parameter delta, which is the condensate, right? So we don't have that here. But this is pair creation, pair destruction. It certainly preserves that, right? So that's the expression of that global Z2 symmetry in this language. Okay? So now that we've got that straight, let's press ahead. We want to finally get to a point where we stare at a formula and remember our undergraduate physics and say Fermi-Dirac distribution. That's the goal. Okay? So let's go a little bit further. So there's two ways to do this. One is to appeal to what we know from the BCS theory of superconductivity and do something called a Bogoliubov transformation to work out the correct quasi-particle operators for this superconductor. But that's just so many words, and I don't want to do it like that. I want to do it from scratch in a slightly different way, in a way that has the advantages of introducing something which have become, some objects that have become very popular nowadays, which are Majorana. So we are going to have yet another small digression. We are going to say that we are allowed to write operators like this one, which are regular fermionic operators that create and destroy fermions that you can then relate to your many particle wave functions. This is not a operator which is the same as its own Hermitian conjugate, right? So it has a real part and an imaginary. Right? C dagger is not the same as clearly, right? So we will write C in terms of its real and imaginary parts and ask what properties they have. So let's write Cj as eta 2j minus 1 plus I eta 2j by 2. So the convention is that the real part is always going to be a eta operator with an odd index, 2j minus 1. And the imaginary part is always going to be an eta operator with an even index. Okay? So we are allowed to write this down as long as we then faithfully follow it up and ask what are the properties, algebraic properties of these operators. Okay? So that's a simple exercise. Let's do that. So of course Cj dagger is eta 2j minus 1 minus I eta 2j, just by taking the dagger, right? And these are real and imaginary parts, so they don't have, they are by definition the same as their own Hermitian conjugate. So what are the properties of the eta that follow from knowing about the properties of C? Well, first, eta dagger equals eta always. Okay. And now you can take the anti-commutators that we know for siege and ask how they are reproduced by these. What do you need for these guys for the regular things to happen here on the left? And again, it's like a 2-minute algebraic exercise to convince yourself that these formulae Cj prime dagger equal to delta Jj prime imply and are implied by, goes both ways, eta k prime equal to 2 delta k. So if it's the same eta, it squares to 1. So these are operators whose square is the identity. That makes them really simple to work. Okay? These are operators whose square, if you act twice with that operator, you've done nothing. Okay? But if you take two of them, they actually anti-commute among each other. That's what makes them non-trivial. Because squaring something and getting identity, we know how to do that. Pauli matrices do that. Right? But Pauli matrices don't anti-commute amongst each other. So these two. So you can think of these as anti-commuting versions of Pauli matrices. Okay? In a loose sort of way. And remember, we are always by definition going to have an even number of etas. Because we start with some bunch of orbitals, which are physical single particle orbitals, and then we are taking real and imaginary parts. There's always an even number. It in fact does not make sense to talk of an odd number of Majorana operators in a finite dimensional vector space. But we don't need all that. Okay, we are almost there. And I have 7 minutes, good. So now, just use these definitions. Right? Just write each C like this, each C dagger like this, plug it into that formula. It's a little bit of plug and chug, 2 minutes. We'll save those 2 minutes and write the answer down. Again, this is something you should check. Okay, it's simple algebra. You should get a Hamiltonian now in this language, which looks like Gj I sum over j
eta 2j minus 1 eta 2j, okay, plus j I sum over j eta 2j eta 2j plus 1. Okay. So let's draw a picture of what this is. Okay. There's an I here, and so if I interchange this 2j minus 1, there will be a minus sign because they are anti-commutative. It would be minus I, right? So we should draw a picture with arrows. Actually, let's draw a picture with 2 colors. So first you go from odd to even, right? And odd to even means actually it's the 2 pieces of the same physical orbital. So it's like the physical site got decomposed into 2 things here, right? And I'm drawing those by bubbles. So there's a sort of a quote unquote hopping between sites inside a physical orbital, which is I. Anytime you have an hopping an I, of course there's an arrow, right? Because the complex conjugate is minus I. And then there is a different hopping which also has an I, but the multipliers are different. This is Gj and this is just J. Right? So for a moment, imagine that these actually represented the hopping amplitudes for just a regular fermionic particle. Right? They had a regular fermionic particle or regular single particle which was hopping like this. If it was here, it hopped here with amplitude I times Gj. And of course, if it was here, it would hop back with amplitude minus I times Gj. Right? And this, on the other hand, would hop forward with I times J and backwards like that. So this would define a hopping problem for a single particle on a one-dimensional lattice. It would be a version of the tight binding model. Right? And you can work out all the single particle energy levels of this tight binding. Right? The last thing I need to show you, can I take 5-10 minutes more or should I do it in tutorial? It might be one of these goals after the final whistle type of thing if I do it now. Huh? Okay, so complete it now? Okay, so they take extra time? Okay, alright. So I need 10 minutes I think to do it properly. Okay. Otherwise you can do it in tutorial. I don't want to rush this. So the statement I'm making is if this picture was the picture for a tight binding model of just a particle hopping on a lattice, right? Then I knew what to do. I would just solve that Schrodinger equation, the discrete version, and get eigenvalues and eigenstates. But this picture is actually representing something more unfamiliar, right? It's representing the coupling of 2 etas. And we don't directly know how to translate that into a Schrodinger equation we solve and get eigenvalues and eigenvectors, right? So that's the last step of the process, which I want to now supply. Okay? And the claim let me make first. The claim is the following. If I have a Majorana Hamiltonian, which I write in general as I over 2 sum over J1, J2, some anti-symmetric matrix J1, J2, eta J1, eta J2. Okay? So why does the matrix have to be anti-symmetric? Remember I'm summing over J1 and J2. So for every J1, J2, there's a J2, J1. And these anti-commute. So if I don't want to get 0, this must also be anti-symmetric. Okay? Why do I need an I? Because that's the only way it becomes Hermitian. Okay? So if I had a Majorana Hamiltonian like this, and this is of course a special case of that, right? The claim I'm making is, you look at the Hermitian matrix Mij equal to I Aij. This is a Hermitian matrix. It satisfies all the simple things you know. It has a complete set of eigenvectors and its eigenvalues you can calculate by solving a Schrodinger equation. So M could be the matrix of hops of a tight binding model of a single particle, right? And that's what I was doing here. I was taking the matrix elements of this matrix that is involved in writing this Majorana Hamiltonian down and interpreting it as a single particle problem for a Hermitian problem, right? And that's the matrix Mij. So the claim is, if you know, so Mij has a spectrum, right? So let's ask, okay, I should go there. So let's write down the Schrodinger equation for Mij, right? For that tight binding one. I have Mij, Vj, sum over j equal to some muth eigenvalue, epsilon mu ei, right? That's the Schrodinger equation for the eigenvectors and eigenvalues of this tight binding model, right? Notice that if I take the complex conjugate of this whole thing, this doesn't change. It's a real antisymmetric matrix. Sorry, this has an I in it. So let's write it like this. I, Aij. So Aij doesn't change, but the I goes to a minus I, right, explicitly. V goes to V star. Epsilon must be real, right? So you learn that sum over j, V mu j star is minus epsilon mu Vi star. So eigenvalues come in pairs, yeah? A is a real antisymmetric matrix, but I've not done anything to the indices. I've just taken a complex conjugate of the whole equation. So the I went to a minus I, V went to V star, V went to V star. Epsilon didn't change. So you have learned that if there was an eigenvalue plus epsilon, there's an eigenvalue minus epsilon. So every positive eigenvalue has a negative partner. The eigenvectors are related by complex conjugation. Okay? So they come in pairs. So this tight binding model has a particle hole symmetric spectrum, epsilon minus epsilon, like that. Okay? The exception is if there's an energy that's zero in this tight binding model. That's very special because this implies that such a fellow must have a real wave function. Okay? Real wave function and zero eigenvalue, or complex wave function and pair. But this matrix is even dimensional, always, because it comes from a Majorana Hamiltonian and there's always an even number of Majoranas. So there's an even number of eigenvalues. The non-zero ones have already come in pairs. So that means the number of zero modes must also be even. These are all completely elementary things we've got just by staring at this, right? Now here's the prescription to go from the Majorana Hamiltonian to something which we can recognize and say, Fermi-Dirac statistics. Okay, last step. So let's do that. So write each of these non-zero energy eigenvectors, right? Which are V, which I label by V, V mu. Write them as the real part plus I times the imaginary part. Okay? And construct these new fermionic operators F. So I started with my electronic orbitals at each side. I rewrote it in terms of this Majorana Hamiltonian. Now I'm constructing some new fermions. And the claim is, and something you can check, by using the fact that all the eigenvectors are orthonormal, by using that fact, you should be able to convince yourself that F mu, these F mu, satisfy the standard algebra of anti-commutation, of canonical form. So in other words, F mu equal to F dagger mu equal to 0 and F mu F dagger mu equal to delta. Okay. This you can check. It follows from two things. It follows from the, so these are only to be defined for mu are the positive eigenvectors. For each positive eigenvector, positive eigenvalue eigenvector, you can make this construction. Okay. So this follows just from the fact that all eigenvectors of positive eigenvalues must be orthonormal, must be orthogonal to all negative eigenvalue eigenvectors, and two different positive ones should also be orthogonal to each other. Those two facts, if you write down in real and imaginary parts, you will get enough conditions to prove all this. Again, very elementary. Okay? This is the conceptual step that's important. The algebra you can work. What happens if there are zero modes? They can come in pairs, of course. We have agreed to that. For every pair of zero modes, just pair them up in some arbitrary way. Let's say there's only one pair of zero modes. Then you can define an additional Z fermion, zero mode fermion. Okay? With that one pair. Let's say there's one pair of zero modes. Right? Remember, the wave functions of zero modes have to be real. Right? So there's no imaginary part. But you take one of those wave functions plus I times the other one to make this pair. So write it like this. So if there's only one pair of zero modes, then there's a unique extra fermion you can define, which is sum over J. This is the first zero mode of the pair. I times second zero mode of the pair. And you can check that this will also anti-commute with all the other ones, right? And with itself it will have this anti. Okay. So this way, you go from having this problem, which is a 2n dimensional problem. There are 2n Majoranas, right? And you have taken exactly half the states. Look, you've taken all the positive ones and half the zero modes. So you've now again got n normal, usual fermionic operators. Okay? What's the advantage of these n? In this language, because we have constructed them from eigenvalues and eigenvectors of A, you finally get something that you can stare at and give the answer. So let's write that last step down. So now if you change variables to, so this is the general statement. The general statement is if you rewrite everything now in this language, so remember, what does it mean to be eigenvectors and eigenvalues of a matrix? As Mustansir was saying, it means you have a bunch of columns here, star. So these are all the eigenvectors arranged as columns, right? All the positive ones first, then the zero energy ones, then the negative ones. All complex conjugated, right? And here are my eigenvalues, epsilon mu, and then some zeros, and then minus epsilon, and then 0, diagonal matrix. And here the eigenvectors are arranged as rows in a giant matrix. So the fact that these are the eigenvalues and these are the eigenvectors means that I can write IA like this. Right? This is the same thing he wrote down. This is for the case where it's unity, the similarity transform. Right? So now take this Hamiltonian, the Majorana Hamiltonian, and plug in this form. It's easier to draw the picture than write the formula down. Plug in this form here, and you will see that miraculously these things will multiply the etas and those things will multiply those etas in exactly the right combinations to get a formula in terms of F and F dagger. So then the last step is this rewriting A like that allows you to write this Hamiltonian as 2 times sum over mu prime f dagger mu f mu minus half. Okay? And this prime simply means, as I was saying, take all the positive guys and take half the zero modes, which means just take pairs of zero modes in that way. Okay? So there's n of these. This runs from n1 to n. Right? And these eigenvalues are just the eigenvalues of that tight binding model. Okay? So now finally I have something where I can use all my hard-earned undergraduate physics knowledge. I can look at this and say, I know what happens. All these are positive. Let's take the case where there are no zero modes. All the epsilon mu's are positive by definition, right? What's the ground state? I have a bunch of positive energy orbitals. What is the Fermi-Dirac distribution at zero temperature? Yeah, so there's just no particles, right? There are simply no particles in the ground state. So ground state is a vacuum of these F particles, which are regular fermions, which are free fermions. Okay? This is the same as writing in band structure sum over P epsilon P minus mu F dagger P Fp. What is the logic we use here? We say, oh, the Fermi-Dirac distribution at zero temperature says all energies up to epsilon mu will be filled, right? And all energies where epsilon P is bigger than mu will be empty, right? And what is that distinction? Why did we say up to mu and not? Because this thing in brackets is negative, you will fill a fermion. If it's positive, you will not, right? That's why you stop at mu. So in this case, epsilon P minus mu is replaced by this. So you stop at 0. And everything is above 0 anyway, so you fill nothing. Okay? So in the ground state, there are no particles, these F particles. So ground state has this very simple description, no particles, right? However, if there are zero modes, you have a ground state degeneracy because the Fermi-Dirac distribution does not specify what you should do. You can either put that fermion in or not. So if there is one pair of zero modes, there is a double degeneracy, right? So last thing I want to do is to go back to that picture of the tight. Now I've convinced you that the picture I drew, I can just stare at that picture, forget Majorana fermions, forget everything else. Just do the tight binding model for that picture. Now with that elementary calculation, we can convince ourselves that in the limit where G is small, what was the ordered state for the regular transverse field Ising model, you have a double degeneracy in the thermodynamic. And we can even work out how the tower of states collapses. And we can check Mustance's worry, in this case, with a proper calculation. So let's do that last. Shall I do it? Or that I do in the tutorial? Okay, good. So in the tutorial, I will start by showing you that I can take that simple model where I have a Schrodinger equation for a particle hopping, but with strong hops, weak hops, strong hops, weak hops in a particular pattern. And we just ask what are the single particle states. And we'll see that in one side, when G is less than 1, there is a single pair of zero energy modes. One of them lives at one end of the chain, the other lives at the other end of the chain. They are exact zero modes in the infinite L limit. At finite L, they are split by e to the minus c times L. And now this is on much surer footing than what I was saying before. So there is some genuine discrepancy then between this quantum way of thinking and effective classical ways where you imagine there's a heat bath in contact and write down Glauber dynamics. Okay? So in the tutorial, we'll do this one last thing. I think this is really nice and cute that you can see the double degeneracy come out of a free fermion calculation of a tight binding model for a chain. By the way, this way of thinking about the transverse field Ising model was popularized quite late in the day actually by Kitaev. He wrote a very influential paper on what he called the Majorana chain, which is just that model I had written. So we'll discuss.